Today, we invited a very distinguished, policy analyst and a scholar, Troy Stangarone, and then he is the director of Hyundai Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and the Public Policy, and also deputy director of the Indo-Pacific program at the Wilson Center. Right, he's going to give us a lecture on Donald Trump administrations in North Korea policy, and then his take on this, the expectation of the Donald Trump administration and the North Korea's negotiation, and on and on and on. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to do this. Having just had an election in the United States, we are in this process of going through a presidential transition. And as I'm sure your audience knows, former President Donald Trump has won the election and will become the United States president on January 20th. During this past election, former President Trump campaigned on the idea of peace through strength. This was a reaction, in essence, to his and other Republican views that former President Biden had shown weakness in foreign policy. So if we look back, for example, at the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the challenges the United States faced there, the outbreak of war in Ukraine, something President Trump has insisted would not have happened if he were still in office, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, there was this sense, at least by the former president's side, that the United States needed to take and show more strength in international affairs. And so when we look at U.S. policy and what we might expect in the Indo-Pacific region or East Asia, and then more specifically in North Korea, the main focus of the Trump presidency's policy will be China. This is an area to where there is overarching political agreement within the United States. We saw last year there, for example, was a bipartisan House Commission on China. It put out a series of recommendations, many of those to deal with China's economic challenges to the United States. But while there's great political polarization in the United States, the one area where you do see a lot of political agreement is on China. And so when we think about the idea of peace through strength, if you look at who former President Trump has taken and so far selected for his cabinet, we have Senator Marco Rubio has the Secretary of State. Congressman Mike Waltz has National Security Advisor. And if you look at other appointees on the security side, including at DOD, what you see is essentially a series of China hawks. And this would seem to align with the policy of a strong policy towards China. But as with President Trump, we know that economic issues matter. And so Howard Lutnick, who is nominated as Secretary of Commerce, one of the things that President Trump has said is that Howard Lutnick would be responsible for U.S. trade and tariff policy. And we know that tariffs are going to be a key point of the Trump administration's policy, both towards China and towards other parts of the world, with the idea of the universal tariff and tariff increases on China and also potentially Mexico and other actors. But one of the things that is sort of interesting about this is that while Senator Rubio, Congressman Waltz, they insist on sort of confronting China, both in the security realm, being strong on on Taiwan, and really taking in, basically pushing China to take and confront it, as opposed to the Biden administration's approach of trying to take and cooperate with China on some issues while also challenging them on others. This could also be what we see ultimately as policy within the Trump administration, because Lutnick takes a much more nuanced view of the use of tariffs. He views them as negotiating leverage. And we know that what ultimately matters really for President Trump is economic issues. So this could suggest that the overall policy towards China and ultimately towards North Korea, which I'll get to in a moment, could be slightly more nuanced. You could see some contradictions, but also that it might not be as hard of a line as some people think so far. Now, when we think about North Korea policy, I think the key thing to keep in mind is that former President Trump will face a different situation than when he came to office in 2017. When he originally came to office the first time, Russia and China, in essence, worked with both the Obama administration before him and the Trump administration to address the growing missile tests and nuclear tests by North Korea. We saw a series of UN sanctions put in place that China and Russia both supported. And at the same time, they encouraged the negotiations between the United States and North Korea. Now, and we look at the current situation, many of the pieces of leverage, what former President Trump called maximum pressure, are gone. Sanctions have a tool of pressure have dissipated. Right now, starting probably about the time the Hanoi summit failed, we saw that basically Russia and China began to take and start to look at sanctions as something that perhaps aren't helpful anymore. And if we look at what former panel of expert members have said, the Russian and Chinese governments both started to back away from sanctions around that time period. So now, given the outbreak of war in Ukraine, we know that explicitly Russia is no longer enforcing sanctions. It's unlikely that China is putting much pressure in terms of sanctions on North Korea either. So much of the pressure tool that we have in terms of economic pressure has been taken away. At the same time, it seems as though Pyongyang has determined that talks with the United States are not beneficial. We've seen this through some of the comments in the US presidential election, to where while it's good that President Trump and Kim Jong-un have good relations, that ultimately relations are going to be state to state and that personalities don't matter. We've also seen other comments suggesting that North Korea may not be too interested in having talks with the United States. But ultimately, the real factor here, I think, is North Korea's relationship with Russia. This has provided Pyongyang with options in terms of what it may do in terms of foreign policy, and given it a way to not necessarily have to engage with the United States in the way it did prior to the pandemic. And so why is the case? When we look at the relationship, we've seen Russia and North Korea not only engage in arms trade and potential sanctions violations in terms of financial sanctions, which have been reported by the New York Times, and in other measures, but really you've seen this relationship grow to become more faceted through the summit meeting this past year with Chairman Kim and President Putin, where they took and they increased their defense relationship by signing a new defense treaty. They took and put in place more means to take and cooperate economically. And you really see this as a growing relationship, one to which Russia has taken and provided political support to North Korea and the UN by taking and vetoing the expansion of the panel of experts mandate. Now, at the same time, US-China competition complicates any leverage that the Trump administration might try to take and gain on North Korea, while China remains the largest licit trading partner for North Korea, though I think there's good reason to believe that overall Russia is now the largest trading partner for North Korea. Because of that competition, there's less incentive for China to take and work cooperatively with the United States on North Korea. And if the Trump administration pursues a policy that is much more aggressive than the Biden administration, I would expect that incentive structure to further decrease for Beijing to cooperate with the United States on North Korea. But ultimately, any real North Korea policy may be tied to the outcome of the war in Ukraine. We've seen some discuss this idea that Russia would end its relationship with with North Korea at the end of the war. I think there's good reasons to believe that might not be the case, but there are indications that the Trump team may be looking to try and any package deal with Russia have them take and eliminate this relationship they've been developing with Pyongyang. But there are good reasons to think that Russia may be reluctant to do this, and that the Trump administration may not have the types of incentive structures it needs to get that in place. So one, both Russia and North Korea share a revisionist view of the world. We clearly see this in Russian aggression in Ukraine, but clearly as North Korea moves more towards this idea of two states on the Korean Peninsula, perhaps looking to take and put in claims towards the islands of the West Sea, we see a revisionist nature taking place. At the same time, both North Korea and Russia want a multipolar world where there's less US influence. The US has been a power that has essentially taken and boxed them in politically and taken and lessened their scope for maneuver internationally, and they would like to see that change and for the US to have less influence over their and other countries' actions. And at the same time, one of the United States' strengths in terms of both sanctions and dealing with problematic behavior, be it North Korean nuclear tests or Russia's invasion of Ukraine, has been the strength of the US financial system and the financial sanctions you put in place. Because of the dominant role of the US dollar, all transactions have to go through the United States, specifically the New York Fed, and that gives the United States the ability to take and track transactions and see what's going on and to enforce financial sanctions on Russia, North Korea, and others. And so this isn't an interest that is shared just between Russia and Moscow. It's one we saw at the recent BRICS summit, that China and even Brazil and other countries are behind. But I think all of these interests take and suggest that in a post-Ukraine period, there is significant likelihood that the relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang will remain. It will be a different relationship than it is now, but you'll see that continued relationship. And so this is why it's key for the Trump administration to include that as part of any talks with Russia over North Korea, or excuse me, over Ukraine. So when we think about how President Trump might approach this issue, I think it's interesting that in a pre-election article, former National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien noted that there's a development of a new Beijing-Moscow Tehran access. What's interesting about this is that it left North Korea out. And instead, what former NSA O'Brien actually says is that North Korea was a country that former President Trump tried to bring in from the cold. And this suggests that both O'Brien and potentially a Trump administration are keeping space available for potential talks with North Korea and to try and have a different type of relationship. One of the key outcomes of the Singapore summit was to build a new US-North Korea relationship. What that would be was never defined. And I think figuring out from a Trump administration perspective what they would like that relationship to be would be a key point in any talks going forward. But I think we can't rule out the possibility of talks. That being said, there are, as I've mentioned, clear constraints in terms of this relationship with Russia. I think there are questions about whether Kim Jong-un, given what happened in Hanoi, would be interested in taking a meeting with President Trump again without specific assurances to avoid a potential walkout again. But this is something that we can't rule out. So if the Trump administration is going to approach North Korea, what is likely to be on the table? What might not be on the table? If President Trump is able to take and separate North Korea from Russia, I think that there are specific flexibilities that could be in play. Without Russian support, really Pyongyang would have to take and focus on its relationship with Beijing. There might be questions about whether it's time now to take and maybe move back into talks, especially if President Trump is looking to make a broader deal, maybe something with China at the same time. So all of these factors could be in play working together. Now, if that's the case, we could see some broader type of relationship. Denuclearization, though, may not be on the table, and I think we need to understand that, but it's more likely to be on the table if you have a situation to where the ties with Russia have been severed between it and North Korea, and perhaps Beijing is coming back into the discussions. If, on the other hand, we see a relationship between Russia and North Korea that remains stable, I think there are going to be real challenges in taking and having a robust deal, specifically one that would address denuclearization. And the reason for this, and I just want to kind of walk through briefly, is if we look at the relationship that's been developing, right now, we can sort of see some outlines of what North Korea has already gained from this relationship. In addition to the end of the UN panel of experts and Russian invitations to at least some of the smaller BRIC meetings that we saw earlier this year, which is providing it some additional diplomatic coverage, there are likely real financial benefits that are going to North Korea from this relationship. South Korean estimates suggest that 9 million artillery shells have been shipped from North Korea to Russia. Those artillery shells, depending on the estimates that have been put out, one of which I have worked on, suggests that North Korea is likely receiving compensation of between $477 per round to $500 per round. That means that just on the artillery shells alone, you're likely seeing North Korea receiving benefits of upwards of $4.3 billion. And that doesn't take into account the KN-23 ballistic missiles that we've seen used by Russia in the Ukraine war, or the recent deployment of over 10,000 North Korean troops. And if we just look at the numbers in terms of troops, Russian press sources suggest that the average Russian recruit earns $2,166 a month. At over 10,000 troops, that suggests there's potential significant revenue just in the troop deployment for North Korea beyond the $4.3 billion I suggested. And if we look at what's coming back, there's been a lot of discussion that Russia is providing North Korea, for example, with fuel, with food, perhaps medicine and some other consumer items. But if we look at the patterns of imports over Kim Jong-un's period in power, take and use sort of the highest levels that we've seen during that period, use those as sort of proxies for what might be being imported. And I think this is a fair estimate because if we look at market prices in North Korea, you're not, for example, seeing prices of rice and other commodities decline significantly, which suggests that Russia isn't flooding North Korea with a large amount of food or fuel. That you could probably get upward towards $1 billion. That suggests that there is likely upwards of 3.2 or more $1 billion worth of compensation that Russia owes North Korea. This is likely going to be on the military side. Ukrainian intelligence has suggested that there is cooperation on ballistic missiles. The KN-23 that I mentioned, we've seen upwards of 50% failure rates on the battlefield. This would seem to be a logical place for Russia to be taking and helping North Korea because Russia has its own interest in seeing the failure rate of the KN-23 decline. And so if we take and put all this in context, that gives us both sort of a bounds in terms of what Russia might be able to and willing to provide North Korea, but also suggests that North Korea is benefiting both militarily, economically, diplomatically from this relationship with Russia. And any type of new engagement with the United States would need to take and put something on the table that's robust enough to take and pull North Korea away if the Trump administration hasn't been able to do that by ending the Ukraine war. And so in that context where there is less flexibility, we might be seeing something that is more really about taking and focusing on arms control, limiting the growth of North Korea's programs, both ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons, but also non-proliferation. One of the other advantages that North Korea is gaining from the war in Ukraine is that it's an opportunity to demonstrate its weapons to other potential buyers around the world. And so having an agreement with North Korea where they do not proliferate, their programs are capped, might be an area to where former President Trump would focus. And part of this would be is that, the challenge that I think the Trump administration faces is that having gone down the denuclearization road in the first term, there have been suggestions that President Trump realizes this may not be something that is feasible. And so if that is the case, then the question is, how do you tamp down the potential challenges you face from North Korea, minimize the chance for conflict, and try to turn the page on the relationship into something that is more productive. So that way, perhaps in the future, you can make additional progress. And so I think these are the two scenarios we need to consider in terms of President Trump's policy towards North Korea. One, whether he is successful in taking and ending the Ukraine war and doing so in a way to where Russia takes and ends its relationship with North Korea, or if he is not, what the circumstances look like in terms of trying to engage North Korea in a period to where it would have potential support from Russia that would make negotiations with the United States less appealing to North Korea. Thank you, and I look forward to having a discussion.
So Donald Trump administration must, deal with North Korea and then China at the same time, plus, Russia. So it's all intertwined with each other. You mentioned, Beijing, Moscow, Tehran, and I think it's Pyongyang, and then some a couple more, cities will be included in that. That axis thing, it was a nightmare, to be honest with you. But I think that's coming back, and that's how I see. So, what's your policy recommendation, for the Donald Trump administration to approach, the China in terms of dealing with the North Korea and Russia at the same time? Because China has been very uncomfortable with this, Russo-North Korea rapprochement last, year or so. They didn't say that, but Xi Jinping actually briefly mentioned about he's not very comfortable with this destabilization in the Korean Peninsula as well as Ukraine, and because of North Korea and Russia. So Donald Trump administration, Donald Trump might be willing to take advantage of this uncomfortable side of China over North Korea and then Russia for the dealing with the United States. What do you think?
So I think first I want to kind of put the Trump foreign policy in like a broader context. We've talked about China, but if you think about this in terms of priorities, priority number one, ending the Ukraine war, and that obviously has this North Korea link. Priority number two is going to be, basically the Middle East, ending this war. So it's, let's end the wars first, basically. Then once that's done, and depending on how that shapes out, then I think the Trump administration will start moving to really focus on China, and then you get this different North Korea context that you're talking about. Now, how do you take advantage of Chinese unease with the relationship between Moscow and Pyongyang? I think this is challenging for a couple reasons. One, even if Beijing is uncomfortable with this relationship, they're clearly not so uncomfortable as to take and really try to step in to stop it. And I think part of this is because if we look at this from China's perspective, I think China views a Russian success in Ukraine as, beneficial to it. And if North Korea is able to take and help enable that to happen, then that benefits China. And so there might be some hurt feelings. I've talked to some colleagues who suggest that perhaps there were some private assurances that were violated between Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping. But whatever it is, this is like a situation to where if Beijing is unhappy, they're not so unhappy as to want to necessarily intervene. And so that then creates a question of like, how much leverage is there for a Trump administration? Now, if you can end the war in Ukraine, once again, not only does that start changing the dynamics between Russia and North Korea potentially, but that might start changing some of the Chinese thinking. And so the question then is, how do you take and go about bringing China into this? I think this is where, if you look at the team that he put in place, they would take the approach of we're going to put pressure on China on this issue, whether that would be, secondary sanctions or telling China that part of any deal with the United States means taking and resolving the North Korea issue. I mean, that would be what a real, like, if you want to talk about peace through strength approach would be, is that you would tie these together. You wouldn't take and do China only, you would do China and the parts together. As I mentioned previously, the harder you go towards Beijing, the more it incentivizes Beijing to pull close to Pyongyang.
All right. Okay, thank you so much. And then I think it's a great, lecture at the same time Q&A session. And then, Troy actually showed his prowess, to cover global as well as regional, and then, Korean, peninsula issues, all the, that was great. Thank you so much.
No, thank you again. It's been a pleasure to be here with you.